Today's debate topic, companies behaving badly, is it on the rise or is such behaviour reducing? We're going to be focusing on the recent corporate scandals of 7-Eleven in Australia and the Volkswagen scandal that rocked the world. Giant corporate collapses such as Enron and the Lehman Brothers are well-known cases where fraud led by greed resulted in dire consequences for many. These cases put ethics, both in business and accounting, at the forefront of the public's mind. Now, over 10 years later from these collapses, we continue to question whether fraud is reducing or if we have not learned from our mistakes. My name is Cara, and I will be arguing that companies behaving badly is on the rise and will not reduce in the future. I will be focusing on two main points: that we rely on whistleblowing as the most common means of identifying fraud, and the second point is that many organisations have a culture that allows for unethical behaviour. A study shows that whistleblowing is the most common means of how fraud is identified. However, the consequences for whistleblowing are so great that they are intimidating to the point where there isn't really a question of whether or not to report fraud. This includes fear of losing your job, falling out with co-workers and managers, and personal confrontations. So for many, the really daunting task of reporting a co-worker is even more off-putting. In 2015, Fairfax Media undertook an investigation where 7-Eleven franchises were found to be committing wage fraud. International students, who were the main source of staffing, were blackmailed to keep quiet with the threat of deportation due to breach of visa conditions. This is modern-day slavery. This investigation came to light thanks to a whistleblower who had finally had enough. These franchises, based on an American model, would not be able to stay afloat had they been paying the correct wages. If victims and whistleblowers had not brought this issue to light, would it have been uncovered, and for how long would it have continued? The chairman of 7-Eleven was quoted saying, "You can negotiate pay with your staff, regardless of what the award is, which is the norm in small businesses in Australia." This brings forward an issue much larger than just 7-Eleven franchises. How many young Australians are actually being paid the correct wage? A defensive argument that arose was that many franchises were unaware of Australian standards. Because of the largely varied differences in workplace rights, conditions, and legislation across the world, one coming to Australia might not know about legal obligations as a business owner and an employer. So, that brings the question, who's responsible for ensuring that business owners are aware of legislation? Should compulsory training be provided when opening or purchasing a business? If consequences were higher, would more people take it upon themselves to ensure that they are aware with and comply with the legislation? Without whistleblowers, a large majority of the small percentage of frauds that is reported would continue to be undetected.
It is important to note the various unethical practices of corporations in the past. However, the rise of technology and social media has made a good reputation and expectation of modern businesses. The public has proven that poor ethics is not excusable, as seen in the modern scandals of 7-Eleven Australia and Volkswagen. Greed is difficult to prevent and control. However, the systems are in place to ensure that there is adequate deterrence to make such behaviour less likely than ever before. I'm Garrett, and as the negative speaker, I'll be arguing that corporate scandals and fraud are likely to reduce in the future. My argument involves the shifting focus of corporate governance and how the government and media are improving ethical regulation. Secondly, I will acknowledge the global nature of business and how modern ethics requires a mingling of cultures. To rebut the affirmative's first argument, whistleblowing in itself is a dangerous endeavour for a variety of reasons, and this barrier could be alleviated with better protections for whistleblowers. This has not stopped ethical members of said businesses from doing the right thing, and businesses provide the avenues for them to do so. According to a study of whistleblowing processes conducted by Griffith University, it was found that 86% of the businesses surveyed confirmed that they had formal procedures in place for staff to report any corporate wrongdoing. Businesses do not want fraud to occur under their watch, and certainly do not actively facilitate it. The consistent factor underlying cases such as the 7-Eleven investigation is greed and profit-driven corporate governance, fostering unethical practices in an entire organization for the sake of profit. While amidst a corporate scandal such as this, it is expected that the head office would rebut by also pointing fingers. In a formal statement, Chief Executive Warren Wilmot decisively stated that they were working with the Fair Work Ombudsman to weed out franchisees responsible for the corrupt behaviour. However, Michael Fraser brought forward a significant amount of insider information regarding the 7-Eleven scandal, including a conversation with an agent selling franchises that posited, "You wouldn't be able to afford to run profitably if you were paying those wages." Evidently, the motivation to facilitate this wage fraud stems from the difficulty of running the business profitably. Companies that perpetrate such unethical behavior often face widespread ire from the media and, as a result, society as a whole. The power of the media in the digital age makes it even more difficult for such significant discrepancies to be ignored or forgotten. As another example, the ATO tax fraud syndicate reflected an extravagant misuse of power, which led to convictions for the high-ranking individuals involved. Tax office investigators worked with the police during the investigation, and digital data used made it easier to trace their crimes. Similar to the fate suffered by those involved with other corporate wrongdoings, the perpetrators in this case stepped down from their positions and were unable to find another position due to the accessibility of their known history with fraud. This factor is rapidly decreasing events of corporate fraud, as information published to the internet exists indefinitely and can be accessed with a simple Google search. The controversy of Turing Pharmaceuticals truly reflects how unethical behavior can heavily damage a corporation and an industry as a whole. When Martin Shkreli became a public figure, he flippantly defended his organization's price increase of a daraprim medication from $13.50 per pill to $750 per pill. Within a day of the news being revealed, Shkreli was considered widely hated, and his blatant attitude incited a forceful investigation, which eventually uncovered evidence of corporate fraud. Social media was a driving factor in the recognition of Shkreli's wrongdoing and contributed to his unethical behavior being brought to the public eye swiftly. There has been an active shift in corporate governance due to similar scandals, and now corporations employ strategies to ensure independence of directors and financial reporting disclosure. These changes, along with the actions of Fairfax Media during the investigation of 7-Eleven, will serve as a deterrent and can lead to a more effective corporate structure, reducing unethical behavior in the future.
As the negative speaker said, many organizations have policies in place for whistleblowers. However, how useful are these policies when many of those committing fraud are often managers or directors? These superiors are in the position to easily dismiss claims and have the power to ensure that this person is removed from situations where they may further uncover fraudulent behavior. While large fraud cases will spread like wildfire in the media, this is often far too late after millions have already been lost. How many companies have successfully committed fraud that we are still unaware of? Many organizations are outcome-driven. Employees are told to find a way or to face unemployment for non-performance. In 2015, Volkswagen was found to be cheating diesel emissions tests with the installation of advanced software that detected when the car was being tested and ultimately concealed the real amount of emissions the vehicle would produce in everyday use. Why cheat emission standards? Volkswagen's engineers couldn't find a solution to build a new diesel engine to meet the new US standards in the budget and the time frame they were given. The culture within Volkswagen was outcome-driven, and the chairman admitted there was a mindset that tolerated rule-breaking. Along with a highly centralized hierarchy and deliberate discouragement of opposing opinions, this has led to a scandal that affected not only the company and shareholders, but the environment and thousands of consumers worldwide. Volkswagen also had an unusually generous bonus system for everyone from line workers to directors, which may have also discouraged any employees from playing whistleblower. The Volkswagen scandal is an example of where employees were put under pressure to produce results and in order to meet expectations, committed fraud. Volkswagen was trying to enter the diesel market in the US before competitors to gain a competitive advantage, but since reporting their first ever loss, was this pressured timeframe really worth it? Organizations are not stopping to think about the consequences of fraud. The fear of getting caught committing fraud is greater than the fear of not meeting KPIs and internal deadlines. This type of organizational culture, which is outcome-driven, drives unethical behavior. People are desperate to keep their jobs, get a bonus or a promotion, and are willing to be unethical in order to achieve this.
To rebut the affirmative's second argument, the culture of profit-driven corporate governance is being condemned in Australia. This means that businesses which continue to operate here are required to follow our ethical standards. This is reflected in both the 7-Eleven and Volkswagen scandals, as the corporations received punishment for their inappropriate action. These companies have been forced to change their practices as a result of investigation and conviction. The leaders who facilitated the wrongdoing have also been removed from these corporations. Therefore, it is expected that these examples will reduce further scandals and fraud in the future. It is clear that the recent Volkswagen fraud was an example of profits blindly driving business. Little care was shown for the procedures put in place to protect society as a whole, because it would cut into the expenditure of Volkswagen. This unethical behaviour cannot be excused, and it wasn't. According to The Guardian, Volkswagen suffered a €4.1 billion loss in 2015 and underwent the largest car buyback in US history in order to fix the misrepresented vehicles. As a result of the US court case, Volkswagen settled to a payment of $4.2 billion and a 3-year organizational probation. There were consequences for Volkswagen, but it is so easy to dismiss all corporations as soulless, profit-driven machines. Culture variation states that people of different cultures have their own sense of morals and laws. This can influence how we should consider fraud. We can analyze Iranian culture, for example, which differs greatly from Australia. Generally, people from Iran would undergo less education due to their circumstances. In life and business, their sole focus and priority would be survival. Thus, they may not as heavily consider the ethical consequences of their behavior. Volkswagen is an international organization, and while its literacy and education is much more in line with Australia, their German values and what they consider important do still differ. Germans are recognized in the business world for their meticulous planning and considerations. As the affirmative speaker mentioned, in this case, Volkswagen was given little time to plan out their effective product. An American or Australian company may have rushed and released a less polished product, which would have had to be repeatedly redesigned and manufactured. Volkswagen opted instead to develop a way around this issue, which aligns with their planning culture. This is still a despicable action by the German company, but it is important to acknowledge that if the car maker was given more time before the new regulations were released, the CEO Martin Winterkorn at the time may have never resorted to this tactic. While cultural variation does not exclude a corporation from judgment, it does provide some level of explanation for why certain fraud has taken place in the past. Now that globalization has become so prominent, it is important that international standards are considered and developed, especially when foreign brands enter a new market. Not all countries think alike. France welcomes the use of nuclear power, where Germany has legislation disallowing the practice. However, France has taken international views into consideration and are now working to cut down their use of nuclear power, from powering 75% of the country's consumptions in 2015 to 50% by 2025. This example shows how shifting ideologies is possible for entire nations, and how globalization will facilitate a general decrease in corporate fraud. Corporations are forced to reach a sense of harmony with partners by following the ethical expectations of the nations they are operating in, which makes more sense than trying to overcome the increasingly efficient fraud investigative procedures. It is difficult to avoid getting caught when committing fraud, and thus, in most cases, it is becoming much easier to simply conform and adapt, as Volkswagen is being forced to do.
In rebuttal, cultures, political, and social norms differ all over the world. As globalization grows, countries need to be aware of these differences and decide what they will and will not accept. There is always going to be someone in a worse-off situation who is desperate to get out, or those people who are driven by greed. If fraud is more accepted in Iran, does that mean Australia too should be more lenient? Or should we stop all trade with them altogether? Neither of these situations are good solutions, and as such, in the future, as now, there will continue to be fraud. Business wouldn't be business without the drive for money, and therefore there will always be individuals who come into power who will manipulate the situation to their advantage. Neither of these situations are good solutions, and as such, in the future, as now, there will continue to be fraud. Business wouldn't be business without the drive for money, and therefore there will always be individuals who come into power who will manipulate the situation to their advantage. In conclusion, greed is all too common, and because of rationalization that everyone's doing it, fraud is going to continue. The consequences of fraud on society and capital markets continue years on, and every week we continue to hear of new multi-million-dollar scandals such as CPA and the ATO. If we haven't already learned from our past mistakes, when will we?
Fraud has remained a consequential risk of business due to humanity's tendency to succumb to greed. It is impossible to prevent fraud, but the globalization of business is facilitating an international standard for businesses to operate under a unified sense of ethics. There is also greatly improved fraud investigation and detection facilitated by the wide-scale adoption of technology and the internet among businesses. These factors consolidate to reduce corporate scandals and fraud, as corporations recognize that there is a high likelihood of getting caught and being vilified by society and their stakeholders. As you can see, there are valid arguments for both sides, which makes it difficult to predict how much of a role fraud will continue to play in Australian business. It is important that corporations remain vigilant and continue to promote ethical cultures and educate their employees about the potential consequences.